You know, throughout most of human history, a man's strength wasn't optional. It was expected. It wasn't about vanity and it wasn't about ego. To be honest with you, it was about survival. It didn't matter if it was the Scottish, picking up rocks and throwing capers, or if it was Roman legionnaires having to march with 60 and 80 pounds on their back 20 miles a day. It was about survival. Today, we live in a very, very soft age of mankind. And while weakness has always existed, in past generations, it was corrected, it was mocked, it was overcome. Now, it's normalized. Now, in some aspects of society, it's even celebrated. Let's talk about it. All right, let's take the Roman legionnaires, for example. Like I said in my intro, a lot of them, they had to march over 20 miles in a day. They had to carry 60 to 80 pounds of armor, weapons, and including a lot of the time their own food, their what we would call toiletries today, their means of survival. They had to be, and after that march, they had to be ready to fight. Weakness wasn't a personal failure to them. It would cost the entire, unit their lives if they weren't able to maintain that strength and be able to do that. You take a look at the American pioneers and Manifest Destiny and the settlers that came after Lewis and Clark. Hell, even Lewis and Clark. Every sunrise meant chopping wood, hauling water to the campsite, hauling water to the homestead, breaking new ground. If you didn't have the grit to endure, your family paid the price. It didn't matter if it was hunger, it didn't matter if it was the cold, it didn't matter if it was Plains Indians or Native Americans that were attacking. You had the American pioneer, the settler, had to be strong, and that included his wife as well. Go back to medieval Europe. Even the farmer, the peasant behind the plow, they had to be strong enough to wrestle the soil and the livestock, or their family died. Knights spent years training to fight in armor and on horseback that also had armor, because they had to be able to carry all of that with them into battle. The entire class identity was built on power, physical power, spiritual power. At the very least, men being able to be strong should be a baseline for society. It should not be the exception. I can't go through this video without talking about historic weaknesses, and their consequences. Weaknesses have always existed with men as well. In Sparta, I have a picture back here of this is one of my greatest gifts, by the way. This is a picture I drew back in high school back in the 1980s. And my son, Nolan, found it and had it framed. But I remember specifically drawing this because we were doing a report on ancient Greece. And, here's an ancient Greek mariner, right? They had to be strong. The Spartans, if a child was born frail, if they were, they were left behind, they were tossed aside, they were killed. That's brutal. But what it did is it reflected an ancient truth that society couldn't afford men who couldn't endure. One of the reasons Sparta became the power that it was is because that it valued strength. Later in Rome, we were talking earlier about the legionnaires and how they had the hike and march 20 miles a day with 60 to 80 pounds of weapon, armor, and food on their back. But later on in Rome, one of the reasons, the empire was built through tough farmers and soldiers, but it began to crumble as later generations grew soft. They outsourced their defenses. You know, they started leaning on mercenaries while people within Rome became fat and happy and lackadaisical. You know, once strength really did define Rome, weakness helped bring it down. You know, in the early 17th and 18th centuries, weakness had its caricatures. You know, you had the powdered aristocrat who wore his flowing clothing, right? And these men were mocked, in satire because they wore the lace, the wigs, and the obsession with fashion. Ornamental is good, but in reality, it's useless. It's admired for its image, not for its capability. And those same men, they were the ones that went off to war. They required and demanded strong men to go off to war for them. Years later, you take a look at somebody in American history, okay? Somebody who was frail. This person was asthmatic. His name is Theodore Roosevelt. Personally, I believe he's in the top 5 of U.S. presidents that we've ever had. But he could have stayed weak, but his father told him, and I'm going to read the quote here, "You have the mind, but not the body, and without the help of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should." At that point, Theodore Roosevelt realized he needed to rebuild himself. He boxed, he hiked, he lifted. He turned weakness into a rugged individual strength that he projected that strength, at San Juan Hill and the Rough Riders. He projected that strength when he went out west, and hunted. But he also realized the strength enough, and he had the spiritual strength enough to realize that certain things had to be preserved. Without that strength that he had built up throughout his years as a youth, he would not have been able to endure what he endured to allow us to become the country that we had during his time. Weakness has always existed, but the difference between back then and now is society today puts up with that weakness. And it's time we go ahead, and I'm not saying look at somebody who's weak and mock them. I'm saying look at somebody who is physically weak, metabolically unhealthy, spiritually weak, and help them. Now let's compare to things that happen today. Modern men are not asked to march 20 miles in armor, okay? They're not plowing fields with oxen and a plow behind them from dusk till dawn, right? However, go to your local grocery store or go to a local gathering area and look at the men that are struggling carrying 2 bags of groceries. Go to the park and find a park with kids and men in them, and I'm not talking a baseball field, even though I love baseball, and you have a lot of overweight and weak men that are out there playing with their kids, but they're not out there setting the example for their kids. They're struggling on the playground, they're struggling on the field to play with their kids because they are weak, because they are metabolically unhealthy. And that is what we have to fight right now. In a world, basically, we've outsourced our strengths. You need a couch moved, you call the movers. Your lawn, your grass is too high, well, you're going to call the landscaper, even though it may be a small yard. Flat tire, call roadside assistance, AAA. Tasks that used to be every day that a man could do. We've started to outsource that. Now, don't get me wrong. If you are able to afford a landscaper because you now have taken back some of that time, go right ahead and do that. But what are you using that time for? Are you using it to better yourself? Are you using it to make sure that you're strong? You know, if it takes you 4 hours a week, right, to do the landscaping and mowing and stuff on your own, are you taking that 4 hours and are you bettering yourself spiritually? Are you going to the gym that extra 4 hours a week? You know, that's the things you need to ask yourself. Or are you continuing to outsource your traditional male strengths to somebody else? You know, today, somebody called them digital dandies, you know, just like in the 17th and 18th century where you had the aristocrats powdering their faces. Today, men curate the perfect online image, you know. They take gym selfies. Well, great, you're in the gym, but are you actually building strength? They stage photos. You know, the ones that I really kind of chuckle at are the people that only believe in running. You know, running has its place, but it doesn't build muscle. It doesn't build strength. You know, and they'll sit there and they'll take a video of themselves. They'll spend 20 minutes setting up a camera so they can go ahead and take a video of themselves running down a trail, right? Hey, look at me, I'm strong, I'm running. You know, basically everything is curated. And don't even get me started on the AI filters on Instagram and YouTube and all these video editing programs, right? Just know that a lot of that is curated, you know, but like Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt himself, weakness does not have to define you. Every man has a chance to turn his fragility into resilience. He has a chance to turn his morbidly obese body into something that is lean and strong and powerful. You know, there's always, you know, something that you can do where you can choose discipline, where you can choose strength over comfort. You know, weakness has always been a part of the human story. Until now, though, it was never really celebrated. I would say since probably the mid-1970s. If you take a look back at photos from the 40s, 50s, 60s, and some of the early 70s, the men that were featured were physically strong. You could see that. They were lean, they were metabolically healthy. And it wasn't celebrated. I don't know exactly how that changed, whether it was celebrate, you know, fat acceptance or any number of other social ailments, you know, but we need to stop celebrating that which is weak. Okay? Look around, you know, take a look at the news. You have certain groups of people that are celebrating weakness. You have certain groups of people that are celebrating deviancy, and they throw phrases like toxic masculinity out and Jim Bro culture, right? And it's one of those things where you're like, when did becoming strong become a negative? And it really isn't. And men, all men, I don't care if you're watching this and you are 10 years old and you are in elementary school, talk to your father about doing push-ups and working out. If you are in your 20s and you just graduated high school and you're out into college or you're out in your job, are you sitting in front of a computer all day or your TV screen playing Xbox or PlayStation? When that time should be, in your prime of your life, you should be doing physical things, lifting heavy weights, hiking the outdoors every weekend, while you know, going out and showing feats of strength to your girlfriend, to your wife. You know, today, really the choice is ours. We can either continue to accept weakness as an identity, right? You do that, our culture and our society are doomed. Or are we going to return to the view strength is not only a duty to ourselves, but to our families and to the generations that follow. You know, one of the reasons I started taking my health seriously at the age of 48, I'm now 54. I have been lifting weights now since about when I was late 49 years old and mid 50s, about 4.5 years now. And one thing that I've realized is that even at the age of 54 now, I wasted a lot of my time being weak, being morbidly obese, being pre-diabetic, when becoming strong actually did more for not only my personal well-being, but for my family, and the positive impact that has come about because of that. It's you can't beat it. Now is the time where we have to go ahead and say, we're going to go ahead and take back the mantle of male strength. We have to. Your wife requires you to be strong. Your children require you to be strong. And your community requires you to be strong. Remember, folks and gentlemen, there is no downside to being physically strong. There's no downside to being spiritually fortified. Thank you very much. Take action, gentlemen. Now is the time.